Superhero weaknesses are often more ridiculous than their powers. Kicking off our list is Captain Marvel Jr., the junior counterpart to the mighty Captain Marvel. This young hero boasts an impressive array of powers, mirroring those of his namesake. Flight, super strength, and even the wisdom of Solomon. He's a formidable force to be reckoned with, a pint-sized powerhouse ready to take on any villain. But here's the truly ridiculous part, the Achilles heel that makes his heroic life a constant tightrope walk. If he says his own name, Captain Marvel Jr., he transforms back into his ordinary, powerless self, Freddie Freeman. Can you imagine the sheer awkwardness of that? Picture this, you're in the midst of a heated battle, dodging laser blasts and trading blows with a supervillain. You need to coordinate with your fellow heroes, perhaps shout out your name so they know who's flanking them. Captain Marvel Jr. to the rest, poof, you're just a kid again, standing there in your civilian clothes while the bad guys have a field day. Talk about an awkward situation. It's a weakness that constantly threatens to undermine his heroic efforts, turning potentially epic moments into comedic fiascos. He's essentially one misplaced introduction away from being completely useless. Coming in at number 9 is Banshee, the mutant with a sonic scream powerful enough to shatter steel. This powerful ability makes him a valuable and often crucial member of the X-Men, allowing him to use his voice as a devastating weapon against all sorts of villains, from sentinels to alien invaders. He can unleash concussive blasts, create sonic force fields, and even fly using his unique vocal power. But here's the tragically ironic thing, if Banshee gets a sore throat, he loses his powers. It's like a world-class opera singer losing their voice right before a big performance, or a stand-up comedian suddenly going mute. Imagine facing off against Magneto, the master of magnetism, a villain who can manipulate metal with his mind. You're ready to unleash a sonic scream that could disrupt his control, but then, scratchy throat. Suddenly, you're reaching for a cough drop instead of your sonic arsenal. Talk about a bad case of laryngitis at the worst possible moment. This weakness makes Banshee's effectiveness incredibly precarious, turning him from a powerful mutant to a vulnerable team member with the slightest tickle in his throat. It's a constant threat that hangs over him, making every battle a potential vocal gamble. Number 8 on our list might surprise you, especially given the sheer power this individual wields. It's Gladiator, the Strontian warrior, a being whose abilities are so vast they're often compared to Superman himself. He can fly at incredible speeds, possesses super strength capable of moving mountains, and is practically invulnerable to most forms of attack. He's a cosmic powerhouse, a force of nature. But here's the truly bizarre catch, the Achilles heel that makes this near godlike being surprisingly fragile. His powers are inextricably linked to his confidence. If Gladiator starts doubting himself, if even a flicker of insecurity creeps into his mind, he becomes weaker. Imagine, the guy who can punch through planets, who can withstand the heat of a star, gets taken down not by a supervillain's energy blast, but by a little self-doubt. It's a psychological vulnerability that seems utterly incongruous with his physical might. He could be facing down a cosmic entity threatening to devour the universe, but if he hesitates, if he questions his ability to prevail, his strength diminishes, his invulnerability falters. Someone get this guy a pep talk, stat! He needs a good therapist, not just super strength training. It's a weakness that makes him a fascinating and ultimately flawed character, a reminder that even the most powerful beings can be undone by their own inner demons. At number 7, we have the Human Torch, the hot-headed, flame-engulfed member of the Fantastic Four. This fiery hero can engulf his entire body in flames, turning himself into a living inferno. He can fly through the air like a human rocket, and he can project blasts of intense heat and fire, making him a formidable opponent. He's essentially a walking, talking, flying bonfire. But guess what? This being of pure flame, this master of combustion, has a truly ironic and utterly bizarre weakness. He's vulnerable to asbestos. Yes, that's right. The guy who can create and control fire is weakened by a fire-resistant material. It's like saying water is weak to a waterproof container, or a bulletproof vest is vulnerable to bullets. The sheer incongruity of it is almost comical. Thankfully, asbestos isn't as common as it used to be, having been recognized as a dangerous health hazard, but the fact remains that this fiery hero, this walking embodiment of heat and flame, could be taken down by something you might find in old building insulation. It's a pretty bizarre weakness for a hero whose entire shtick revolves around fire, a vulnerability that just doesn't make logical sense. It's a testament to the sometimes strange and often humorous logic of comic book weaknesses. Landing at number 6 is the man without fear, Daredevil. Blinded as a kid, Matt Murdock developed super senses that let him see using sound. But here's the kicker. Loud noises can completely overwhelm his senses and incapacitate him. Imagine, the guy who takes down ninjas and mob bosses gets taken out by a car alarm. And it's not just sounds that can take him down. Strong smells can also overload his senses. Talk about a sensory overload. It's worth noting that this weakness isn't always consistently applied. In some versions, like the Ben Affleck movie, rain actually enhances his radar sense, but in others, it's a major vulnerability. Coming in at number 5 is the king of Atlantis, Aquaman. He can breathe underwater, talk to fish, and swim at super speed. But take him out of the water for an hour, and he's basically a fish out of water. Seriously, the dude who commands the ocean loses his powers from dehydration? It's like saying a bird can't fly without a nest. This weakness really limits his effectiveness as a hero, especially when you consider that most of the world is covered in water, but most of the crime fighting happens on land. Someone get this man a bottle of water, stat! Number 4 on our list is a bit controversial. It's Wonder Woman, the Amazonian warrior princess. Now this weakness is thankfully a relic of the past, but it's too weird not to mention. In her early days, Wonder Woman would lose all her powers if a man tied her bracelets together. Yeah, you heard that right. Bondage was her kryptonite. This weakness was linked to her creator's interest in the practice, and it played into some pretty outdated gender stereotypes. Thankfully, DC Comics realized how ridiculous and offensive this was and got rid of it. At number 3, we have Green Lantern, the wielder of the most powerful weapon in the universe. But guess what? For a long time, his ring was useless against the color yellow. And even worse, the original Green Lantern, Alan Scott, was weak to wood. A being with the power to create anything he can imagine can be defeated by a banana or a tree branch? That's just bananas. The weakness to yellow was eventually explained as a representation of fear, which is interesting when you consider the psychology of color. Yellow is often associated with happiness and optimism, but it can also represent anxiety and cowardice. Zooming into number 2 is the fastest man alive, the Flash. He can run faster than the speed of light, travel through time, and even vibrate through walls. But here's the catch. In some older comics, if he ran too fast, he could die. It's like saying a car is too fast for its own good. However, this weakness isn't consistently applied anymore. The Flash has become so fast that he's basically outrun his own mortality. Still, it's a pretty ridiculous concept when you think about it. And finally, the number 1 superhero weakness that makes no sense is Superman and Kryptonite. The Man of Steel, who can fly, lift mountains, and move faster than a speeding bullet, is brought to his knees by glowing green rocks from his home planet. It's like being allergic to your own planet. And how is it that every villain seems to have a chunk of kryptonite lying around? It's the most overused and illogical weakness in comic book history. It's also worth noting that there are different colors of kryptonite, each with its own bizarre effect on Superman. Red kryptonite, for example, can cause him to grow extra hair, lose his powers, or even turn into a giant ant. And some people theorize that kryptonite's effects aren't just due to radiation, but because it's infused with the screams of Superman's dying people. Talk about a dark and twisted weakness.
Number 10. He doesn't have wings! One thing that we saw in the trailer for Ant-Man and the Wasp was Scott's realization that Hope's suit has wings, and his doesn't. And there's essentially no reason for that I've been able to find. You'll see a lot of excuses like, oh, they get in his way, or they'd impede his heroics, or hinder his fighting style. But guess what? They work just fine for the Wasp. I'm thinking the extra half hour it would take to get used to the wings would be far eclipsed by the usefulness of having freaking wings, because you'd be able to fly instead of having to run and jump around or use ants. Please let me know in the comments if you're aware of a reason for this, other than it differentiates the Wasp from Ant-Man, because I'm stumped and I couldn't find a reason. Number 9. Criminal history. This is one of the few weaknesses that don't really affect Hank Pym, but affects Scott Lang and Eric O'Grady. When Scott Lang first became Ant-Man, he was an ex-con. He'd been an electrical engineer, but when he was unable to support his family, he turned to crime. He stole from the company he worked for, took a bit for himself, and redistributed it to the customers of the company. So like, it was the good kind of crime, but still a crime. When he was caught, he was sent to prison for 5 years, and this criminal past continues to affect him even to this day. Now, granted for Scott, this isn't much of a big deal other than the usual drawbacks of being an ex-con, largely because A, it was a pretty good crime for good reasons, and B, because he's done a bunch of good as Ant-Man. On the other hand, this is a huge issue for Eric O'Grady. All his past misdeeds, made even worse because they were committed while he was Ant-Man, cause him to be super conflicted. It feels like he's a bad person trying to do good things, and while this did cause him to try to redeem himself, it's a source of constant distress for him. Number 8. He's still super light. This goes for all the Ant-Men. One thing that the Ant-Man movie kinda glossed over, much to the chagrin of Ant-Man fans, was his weight. We know that Pym particles allow the shrinking by compressing the space between atoms, but while Scott was clearly significantly lighter in the movie since he was able to run on top of dudes without them noticing, they didn't explain why this is. The comics, however, have an answer. Not only do the Pym particles push the atoms closer together, but they also shift most of the mass to a pocket dimension. This is how he can run on top of people and how they can carry around cars and tanks without breaking their backs. Why is this a weakness? Well, this lightweight can be taken advantage of since it means that he can be picked up and thrown or kicked, and there isn't really much he can do about it other than go big again. Sure, it'd be tricky to hang on to him if he's so small and he's still strong enough to fight back, but his lightness can be a bit of a hindrance in fights. That said, it also lets him ride on ants, and that's awesome, so I'd say it's worth it. Number 7. Hubris. If you've seen Age of Ultron, you'll remember how Tony Stark and Bruce Banner, in trying to help humanity, very nearly doomed it by bringing Ultron to life. Well, not life, but you know what I mean. This hubris was very nearly the end of humanity, but in the comics, it went a bit differently. In the comics, it was Hank Pym who created Ultron, the criminally insane sentient robot, even using his own brain patterns as the basis for Ultron's robotic mind. Hank decided that he was so smart that he could totally go ahead and create artificial intelligence. Nothing could possibly go wrong because Hank Pym is a genius and is awesome, and oops, Ultron's gone and taking over everything. Yeah, his belief that he could play God brought about one of the most dangerous villains the Earth has ever seen. If that's not a weakness, I don't know what is. Number 6. The dangers of going subatomic. One particularly impressive ability of the Pym particles is they can allow one to go subatomic. As I explained earlier, part of what the Pym particles do is shift your mass to another dimension. If he goes too small and the vast majority of his mass has been shifted over, he can enter alternate dimensions. This is super useful if you want to enter the microverse or go hang out with the Living Tribunal, but as we learned in the Ant-Man film, this can also go very badly. On one mission in 1987, Janet and Hank found themselves unable to disable a Soviet missile. Janet bravely removed her regulator, which allowed her to shrink to subatomic size and get in and disarm the missile. Unfortunately, this caused her to become lost in the quantum realm. Now, thankfully, we know she was able to come back, but it's a definite danger that Ant-Man and women face. Number 5. Dependence on tech. This is a pretty self-explanatory one that's true of all the Ant-Men. A lot of superheroes have pretty amazing powers that are part of them at all times. Superman, Scarlet Witch, Deadpool. So many heroes could go out as naked as the day they were born and still be the effective heroes they are. And Deadpool sometimes goes out of his way to be naked. Even Spider-Man, who depends on his web shooters a lot, could still be a damn fine hero without them. But Ant-Man, without his ability to shrink and grow, is basically just mental illness man, not counting Scott Lang. Whether it's his shrinking suit or the helmet that lets him communicate with ants, Ant-Man without his gadgets is just a dude with a stupid name. Of course, there is an exception. Repeated exposure to the particles have caused Hank Pym to be able to grow and shrink at will, but he still needs his helmet and suit to do any real heroism. Number 4. Mental instability. Yep, I've hinted at this earlier. If you've read the comics, you've probably guessed that this is a Hank Pym one. For ages, Hank grew and shrank with the use of Pym particle serums, and everything was dandy. But as time went on, he started to have more and more psychological issues, which turned out to be a side effect of the particles. He became increasingly depressive and irritable, and eventually even developed a split personality. This was in the Yellow Jacket years, and while this extra personality did allow him to finally propose to his girlfriend in a bit of an aggressive way, it led to the act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He struck Janet out of frustration, and abuse is a big no-no. He eventually learned to make the helmet protect his brain, which allowed later Ant-Men like Scott Lang to take on the mantle without the nasty side effects. Thankfully, in recent years, he has reformed big time, and has even taken the Yellow Jacket persona on again in an attempt to make up for the harm he had caused previously. I mean, he's not perfect considering he's currently Ultron, but that's a story for another time. And by another time, I mean later in this video. Number 3, he's too randy for his own good. This is an Eric O'Grady one. It's like he was trying to one-up Hank Pym in a game of who's the biggest dirtbag, and the dude kept letting his burning loins get the better of him. For one, he uses his powers in pretty lecherous ways. Don't use that word often. Anyway, yeah, he had a habit of saving attractive women, and using that fact and the fact that he's a superhero to try to get into their pants. And if they weren't into it, that's cool, he'll just follow them home and spy on them in the shower. True story. He even stalked Miss Marvel once while she was the leader of the Mighty Avengers. He hid in her purse, went home, and watched her shower. Now, is this something that a hell of a lot of nerds would do if they had his abilities? Probably. Does that make it okay? No! Not only that, but he seduced the girlfriend of his dead best friend Chris, made out with her at his grave, later knocked her up, and left her. Holy crap. His excuse was that he wouldn't be a good father, and frankly, I think he's right, but that is so not cool. Number 2, selfishness. This is another one for Eric O'Grady, who was just a big ol' jerk. For one, he became Ant-Man in this first place when he stole it out of selfishness. Not only that, he would use the Ant-Man suit to commit crime. Yeah, not exactly the usual MO of a superhero, whether he's stopping a thief and taking what they stole for himself, or even using the distraction of a superhero fight to commit a robbery of his own, the dude is always putting his own selfish desires over the greater good. He even severely burnt the face of his friend when he was stealing the Ant-Man suit, plus after taking over the mantle of Ant-Man from Scott Lang by stealing the suit, much to the chagrin of pretty much everyone, he decided the best way to make himself look better would be to put Scott down as much as possible. He would slander him, claiming that the crimes committed by Eric were actually committed by Scott. This got worse when Scott's daughter Cassie heard him, they fought, and he eventually smacked her into the ground. What does he say? Who's your daddy now? Number 1, inferiority complex. This one is of course referring to Hank Pym. Now it's true that superheroes tend not to be the most mentally healthy individuals. Sure, they put forth a confident exterior, but on the inside, many doubt themselves a good deal, with a bit of imposter syndrome sprinkled in. But Pym takes this to a new level. He constantly feels as though others look down on him, and he cares way too much about what people think. This caused him to act out in an attempt to prove himself, which often ends up going very poorly. Whether he's abusing his wife, abandoning his team, or going rogue, Hank has been known to let his inferiority complex get the better of him. It even caused him to change persona time and time again when he thought his friends weren't giving him enough credit. Ant-Man, Giant Man, Yellow Jacket, just make up your mind. This has recently proven to be a detriment to him with all new, all different Ultron. After months alone, Pym joined with Ultron's hate for the Avengers, and Pym's feelings that they had abandoned him, causing him to strike out. Now, in reality, they just thought he was dead, but he immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Definitely relate to that. I'm really bad with that kind of thing. I guess Hank and I will have to work on this one together.
Number 10, lack of imagination. Bobby is actually one of the most powerful mutants in the Marvel Universe, and yet people might not always think of him first when it comes to some of the most powerful mutants around. This could be because what often holds Robert Drake back is his own imagination. It turns out Iceman has actually been capable of accomplishing insane feats with his powers, which we've only begun to see in more recent years. He can create sentient ice golems and change not only his own form from ice to water, but others as well. So what has prevented him from doing this in the past? Apparently his lack of imagining that he could. This fact also makes me wonder if this is true for other mutants apart from Bobby. Could all mutants be a lot stronger if they were just a little bit more creative? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, be sure to show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on that bell notification so you don't miss out on any nerdy content. Number 9, drying out. I'm so glad this is no longer a weakness. For a while there, Aquaman had to be submerged in water periodically, otherwise he would literally dry out. He would also get weaker the longer he was away from water, and of course could even die if he was permanently kept out of water for long enough. And I believe this started affecting him after like an hour of being out of water. Not a lot of time. Number 8, bug spray. Yep, there have been times when Spider-Man was actually targeted and almost successfully defeated with, you guessed it, bug spray. Because he is a mutate, having had his genes in essence spliced with that of the radioactive spider who bit him, Spider-Man has both the strengths and in some cases the weaknesses of a spider. This not only includes a weakness to bug spray, but also a weakness to cold environments as well. In fact, if you used enough bug spray, you could even permanently defeat Peter Parker by ending his life. That's right, bug spray isn't just a nuisance for Spider-Man, it can actually be downright deadly. Ethyl chloride specifically is the substance that Spider-Man finds himself weakened by. When exposed to the substance, it weakens Spider-Man, draining him of his powers and threatening his very life. Number 7, yellow. The color yellow has to be up there as one of the weirdest weaknesses that we have in comics. For a good long while, this was a weakness shared by all Green Lanterns, especially odd when you consider just how powerful Green Lanterns are considered to be. So why were they weakened by a color? Well, while definitely silly on paper, it actually has to do with the rich history of Green Lantern lore. Green Lantern's opposing emotional color, you see, was yellow, which represents fear in the world of the cosmic emotional spectrum. Because green represents willpower, of course, the only thing that could undermine their abilities would be the emotion of fear. This was also inherently built into the lanterns, as well as the physical manifestation of fear, Parallax, was trapped within the Green Lantern power battery, making this, in essence, a built-in weakness. One that would also serve to consume Hal Jordan, who would ultimately become corrupted by fear and then later be possessed by Parallax as a result. Number 6, hold your breath. This was once a weakness that ruled over Kitty Pryde, aka Catherine or Kate Pryde's mutant powers. Initially, Kate could only phase so long as she was holding her breath, which prevented her from phasing indefinitely. However, as time went on, Kate would learn how to manipulate the air in her lungs, which meant that she was eventually free from this weakness, making her a lot more OP today than she once was. Although in my heart, Kate has always been OP, even when she had to hold her breath. Number 5, wood. Does this weakness sound ridiculous to you? Because it certainly does to me. When you think of a superhero, you usually think of someone who is capable of defeating your common run-of-the-mill criminal in a single punch. We think of beings who can fly and shoot laser beams from their eyes, who are impervious to damage from even some of the most dramatic blows. And then there is the original Green Lantern, Alan Scott, with his weakness to wood. Why did Alan Scott initially have this weakness? Well, there have been a few reasons that have been used in an attempt to explain this. One is that as a lantern, he was simply only invulnerable to metals, so wood was just something that wasn't a thing he was invulnerable to. Another is related to a conflict with the previous Green Lantern who wielded the lantern and was an alien who misused his powers, and as such, Alan was simply punished as a result of that previous Green Lantern's folly, because he has his lantern. There was another reason that said the wood weakness came from the fact that the Green Lantern came from green glowing things, and as such couldn't, or wouldn't, be used to do harm to its own kind, which would be wood, trees, nature, that kind of thing. Another still was explained as Alan's own fear of being knocked in the back of the head with a wooden club, which happened on his first outing, and that was the reason why. It was like a built-in fear, he had to overcome it. But either way you slice it, the idea that an all-powerful being like Green Lantern could be defeated with a baseball bat, it's pretty silly, let's be real. Number 4, superpowers. Iska is a super interesting character. On one hand, she is extremely powerful and can never lose. She can even potentially have her power utilized to manipulate the stakes of other competitions that she is pulled into. However, this also implies that there are times when she has zero control over her powers, in the sense that she cannot influence the result of an unbalanced battle, or that she can be used to give someone else, a rival or even an enemy, the upper hand by including her in a wager or a fight. Her powers force whatever side she is on to become victorious, regardless of whether or not she even wants that to happen. This has meant that Iska has been forced to turn her back on her own people, the mutants of Arakko, more than once. She has also had to fight against family, colleagues, and friends before as a result. Which, I don't know, if you ask me, that kind of sounds like a weakness because you gotta live with that, so that would kind of suck. You always win, but at what cost? Number 3, organic materials. Power Girl probably has one of the weirdest weaknesses around in comics. Despite being a Kryptonian, and sometimes an Atlantean, depending on the time period and version of the character we're talking about, who is on the level of Superman when it comes to her powers and her strength, she can easily be harmed simply if you use organic materials to hurt her. You know that saying about sticks and stones may break your bones? Well, for Power Girl, despite having super durability, this is actually true. Sticks and stones could break her bones, but industrial steel probably wouldn't for some reason. Fortunately, Kara no longer has this weakness anymore, but for an embarrassing little while in the 90s, she did, so. Number 2, power inhibitors. Remy LeBeau often seems to be considered an underrated X-Men. He can create massive explosions using kinetic energy, which he focuses on an object that is charged by his touch and explodes. Typically prefers playing cards just because they're fast to charge, but he could charge really big stuff if he wanted to. He also has great control over his powers, but there is something you might have noticed in the comics when it comes to his power set. He never seems to charge people or any organic life forms. What's up with that? For many, they might just think that Gambit chooses not to because, well, he's ultimately a hero, although this rule isn't always consistently applied, as sometimes writers do forget about it. But if you were wondering why, for the most part, Gambit can't charge living beings, it's actually because of Mr. Sinister. Gambit made a deal with Sinister to operate on his brain in order to help him control his powers more, while also limiting them so that he doesn't basically go haywire and kill everyone he loves. This means his own weakness in regard to the use of his abilities is actually kinda self-imposed. Number 1, red kryptonite. Red kryptonite has to be one of the goofiest weaknesses to have ever existed in all of comic book history. I know that's a bold statement to some, but I honestly stand by it. Why is red kryptonite so dumb? Well, because it's completely unpredictable. It's like chaos incarnate when it comes to Superman weaknesses. This is because it was stated that each piece of red kryptonite had different effects. In fact, it was also suggested that after 24 to 48 hours of a particular effect taking hold, it would subside. But if exposed to the same piece of red kryptonite again, a Kryptonian would become victim to a whole different side effect for some reason. But then it has also been stated that once a Kryptonian is affected by a piece of red kryptonite, that whole piece is rendered powerless and can't be used against them ever again. Basically, red kryptonite is a bundle of contradictions, mainly used as a plot device to do whatever the writer needs to do to Superman for their story. List of side effects includes, but are not limited to, power loss, turning evil, excessive hair growth, blindness to all things green, insanity, and turning into a dragon.
And at number 10, Thor. Starting off our list with the Asgardian god of thunder, let's take a look at the OG Avengers' weaknesses in both the comics and the MCU. In Avengers Endgame, spoiler warning friends, we got to see a different side of Thor, one that was wildly insecure. As a result of not being able to kill Thanos and retrieve the gauntlet after the Mad Titan initially snapped in Avengers Infinity War, Thor carried around a ton of guilt, even after he decapitated the villain at the start of Endgame after it was revealed that he had wished the stones out of existence. See what I mean? Super spoilery. In that 5-year gap that followed, Thor became a recluse, hiding out in New Asgard, drinking large quantities of beer and putting on a ton of weight. Actor Chris Hemsworth even donned a fat suit for the majority of the film. Thor eventually got over his insecurities after the Avengers succeeded in resetting the snap, and majorly stepped up when the 2014 timeline Thanos appeared on Earth to get all the stones once and for all. So MCU Thor's weakness? Well, his insecurities. Fat Thor also got some major backlash for being the butt of a joke rather than an obvious cry for help, a hero struggling with his mental health and enduring some serious body shaming throughout. But moving on from the MCU to the comics, perhaps his weakness in the comics is even better when it comes to comic relief, since it clearly wasn't intended to be as such. In the early days, Thor's Mjolnir was depicted in an almost phallic way, and he'd flaunt that hammer like there was no tomorrow. It was often tied exclusively to his powers, and if he'd ever let go of his hammer, something unfortunate would occur. If he let go of it for more than 60 seconds, he would return to his secret identity of Donald Blake, rendering him powerless. Enemies like Loki would go out of their way to ensure that when Thor threw his hammer, it wouldn't be able to return to him. This weakness eventually got revised thanks to some mystical magic, but for a while it was a complete nuisance for the god. And at number 9, Hulk. The Hulk is arguably the most overpowered Avenger. Literally, the angrier he gets, the more impossible it is to defeat him. He just grows stronger and stronger, more invulnerable the more pissed off he is. He can even withstand amounts of nuclear radiation that can wipe out the whole damn planet. But in some cases we have seen the Hulk be vulnerable. The MCU version of the hero has done a really fantastic job of establishing that delicate balance. The comics have their moments too, including this fun little panel in which we see one of the Hulk's most perplexing but relatable weaknesses: puppies. Seriously, his fellow heroes unleash a ton of puppies on the big green monster and he chills out immediately. Nothing like man's best friend to turn Bruce Banner into a gentle giant. Thank God he is not allergic. Moving on to number 8, Hank Pym. Hank Pym is a man of many mantles. Initially debuting as Ant-Man, he's donned the alias of Giant Man, Goliath, and Yellow Jacket over the years, to name a few. But one of his most consistent and memorable traits is his struggle with his mental health, which has often been the catalyst in major events in the comics such as the introduction to Ultron. Although mental health struggles should not be seen as a weakness, when you're an incredibly powerful superhero with the kinds of responsibilities that the Avengers have, admitting that you need help sometimes is absolutely essential, and that's something that Hank's earlier writers rarely explored. In the comics, Ultron is Hank's creation and the sentient robot ends up wiping his memory, only for Hank to later discover that he was responsible, triggering one of his mental breakdowns. His instability caused him to lash out at his wife Janet in one of the most controversial moments in comic history, in which Hank beat her after being kicked out of the Avengers for irrationally attacking a foe who had surrendered. He then suffered from schizophrenia, taking on the Yellow Jacket mantle and a whole new personality. And when he went to work for the West Coast Avengers as a scientific advisor, he ended up almost committing suicide over how depressed and guilty he felt about all of his prior actions. actions. Dude has really been through hell and back. And his history is the perfect example of how the responsibilities of being a superhero can really take a toll on a character's mental health, ultimately resulting in some really chaotic events. Moving on to number 7, Wonder Man. Wonder Man is a member of the Avengers that we haven't seen up on the big screen yet, but has proven to be quite powerful in the comics. He's immortal, and the full extent of his power is still unknown. But similarly to Hank Pym, Wonder Man, aka Simon Williams, is often victimized by his mental health, and has also suffered from full-blown mental breakdowns in the past. It even gets to the point where Wonder Man becomes a pacifist in Uncanny Avengers, refusing to fight altogether. Up next, number 6, The Vision. While Vision in the MCU seems pretty infallible at times, although has shown to be susceptible to electric and magical attacks, the Vision of the Marvel Comics has had it a bit rougher at times. In the MCU, we got to see the Ultron-created robot powered by the Soul Stone, whereas in the comics, he's just a highly advanced sentient robot. Initially, every time he's destroyed, he can be rebuilt. So despite his robotic weakness, at least there is a silver lining. More interestingly though, Vision in the comics is often held back by his pursuit of being human. He can also fall victim to rigidity. Because he can increase his density, it takes a lot of energy to move his muscles and maintain being that intangible. And at his maximum density of 90 tons, he becomes immovable, immobilized in place until he reduces his density back. So you can see how that could be problematic at times in battle. And at number 5, Spider-Man. Peter Parker's flaws and incredibly realistic personality traits is one of the reasons why the web slinger has resonated so well with readers all across the globe. It's also why he's considered to be one of Marvel's most popular and beloved heroes of all time. And without getting into the complexities of his character, his superpowered abilities also have flaws, something that always felt like a really nice touch. We're talking Peter's spider sense specifically here, a precognitive ability that allows him to sense things that others can't, a tingling in the back of his skull that allows him to detect danger before it occurs. Now this sense has been proven fallible though. There's been cases where Spider-Man's sense hasn't worked thanks to a common cold, gas attacks, overstimulation, or because a foe like the symbiote Venom doesn't activate said sense. So you can see how that might be an issue when, fighting a battle against a symbiote and not expecting to get hit from behind. And at number 4, Iron Man. Tony Stark may be a literal genius capable of the most impressive scientific feats, but thanks to his personality, he's hit a few road bumps in both the comics and the MCU. But specifically in the comics, one of those biggest hitches came in Iron Man issue 120 in the story Demon in a Bottle, which had Tony facing off against an antagonist he didn't know how to handle, his own alcoholism. Often his biggest obstacle is himself. This even made its way into the MCU with Iron Man writer Matt Fraction saying of the character, I quote, "He has a big gaping hole in his chest that he has to keep shoving things into. You don't need a roadmap and a flashlight to figure out the symbolism there." I mean, well said. And at number 3, Captain America. Captain America may be the Avengers leader and often has an impenetrable spirit, but at the end of the day, he's one of the only main Avengers who lacks something, simply because he's human. Sure, thanks to the super soldier serum, he has superhuman strength, agility, durability, stamina, and endurance. But compared to the likes of an Asgardian god, an irradiated hulking monster with unlimited strength, and a dude in a robotic suit that can seemingly do anything at times, Cap looks pretty pale in comparison. It's not just his physical abilities that make him weaker than a solid chunk of the team though. Steve Rogers often has been the target of manipulation. The character sometimes has a naivety that villains have taken advantage of. He really wants to see the good in everybody, and trusts that human beings are inherently good. But that's backfired on him multiple times. And in cases like Secret Empire, where an alternate timeline Steve Rogers is manipulated into being a sleeper Hydra agent, that kind of susceptibility can be a real danger. Up next at 2, Sentry. Sentry has often been compared to DC's Superman. After all, he is a character with the power of a million exploding suns. When we first met Robert Reynolds, it was long after the Avengers and the Marvel Multiverse had been established. Reynolds was a man who woke up one day and remembered that he was the superhero Sentry, a narrative that would retcon a whole lot to explain why the entire Marvel 616 universe had forgotten his existence. Turns out that the all-powerful Sentry actually has an alter ego within him, a repressed side that is evil known as the Void. In order to keep the Void at bay, Sentry worked with Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, among others, to wipe Sentry from everyone's memories in order to keep the Earth safe from Void, with Reynolds living as a regular mortal up until his memory comes back. Now Sentry is constantly trying to keep the Void at bay. Void has all the same abilities as Sentry does, meaning whenever Sentry slips up, the heroes of the Marvel Universe have a whole lot of trouble on their hands. And finally, in at number 1, Scarlet Witch. Scarlet Witch is arguably one of the most powerful Avengers, let alone heroes in the Marvel Universe. She manipulates something called chaos magic, which allows her to alter reality at will. But here's the kicker. In both the MCU and the comics, Wanda has had trouble controlling her powers. The MCU version, played by Elizabeth Olsen, struggles to control her abilities, which was a catalyst in Captain America's Civil War when she was unable to manage her powers, which caused Lagos catastrophe, in which her attempt to prevent an explosion that came from Crossbone's suicide vest from killing Captain America ended up destroying nearby buildings and killing innocent bystanders. In that case, Wanda's weakness can be chopped up to inexperience and insecurities. But in the comics, it's slightly different. The character has struggled with her mental stability, which triggered story arcs like the House of M event. She removed every single mutant's powers on Earth with her reality-altering abilities by simply saying the words, "No more mutants." And in the Avengers 503, she was convinced that the superhero team were trying to take her children away from her. Her children actually turned out to be constructs of her own mind, unfortunately. So she lost it and then erased a handful of them from reality. She struggled with depression and even severe suicidal thoughts at one point too. Once again, mental health issues are not a weakness, but it is easy to see why Wanda having good mental health is a necessity in the Marvel Universe. In at number 10, sensitive senses. There are a fistful of characters whose powers include some sort of enhanced sense or senses, such as the case with Marvel's Daredevil, a man whose lack of vision doesn't stop him from being a fantastic hero. His accident, while responsible for the loss of his eyes, enhanced his other senses. Now this includes echolocation, an ability in which Matt Murdock can partially see thanks to his hearing acting like a powerful radar, kinda like a bat. But because of this, he's sensitive to loud noises, and in the past we've seen high decibel sounds mess him up. For example, in Daredevil Volume 2, Worst Case Scenario, Purple Man uses ultrasound to leave Matt in an excruciating amount of pain. Now this weakness goes beyond enhanced senses. Villains don't target extrasensory abilities nearly that much either, and you'd think that a foe would use that information of a hero's power and then find a way to overwhelm their minds. Instead, we more frequently see characters who have an invulnerability to psychic attacks being more of a threat to those who use telepathy, or telekinesis. In at number 9, no peripheral vision. This one kinda seems like a given, but I personally cannot think of a single comic in which I've seen this go down. Also, feel free to comment in those comments below and inform me. So, have you seen some of the cowls and helmets on these heroes? It's like wearing horse blinders on your head. The lack of peripheral vision should be a major issue in the superhero community, but we never really see or hear about it, do we? It would be easy to sneak up on some heroes and, being in their blind spot, attack them. Now obviously that wouldn't happen with a hero like Batman, who's just like prepared for everything and can probably see out of the back of his head, but that being said, not everyone is Batman. It's also surprising that more heroes don't suffer from tunnel vision either. A self-imposed tunnel vision, that is. In at number 8, unprotected faces. Here's one that we really adore. So, say you're a superhero. You have superpowers and you want to put them to good use. So you whip up a costume and begin a career as a vigilante in your hometown. But a few neighborhood patrols in, you find yourself face to face with an armed criminal. He manages to catch you off guard and points a gun right at you. And bam, shoots you right in the face, specifically where your mouth is, because like many other superheroes, you wear a cowl or a helmet that covers the top of your head and your eyes and the sides, but is lacking in the lower half of your face, leaving that area exposed. Now imagine if someone got close enough to Batman and stuck a gun right into his jaw and shot him point blank. Bruce Wayne can survive a lot, but a bullet to the brain, still pretty questionable. Although I feel like he would somehow be so prepared that he would know that was gonna happen, so maybe Bruce Wayne isn't the best example to use there. In at 7, open spaces. Imagine this. You're Peter Parker. You're chasing after a villain who's committed a slew of crimes and put innocent lives in danger. While tracking them down, your investigation takes you to a big, wide open area, like a rural field or some other vacant land with relatively flat ground. And that is when you get jumped. But guess what? There's nothing to shoot off your webs and swing around from. Sure, you can jump and be acrobatic and whatnot, but if there's one thing that Marvel's PS4 Spider-Man video game has taught us, it's that Spidey dominates when he's up in the air. And it is much easier to get hurt or shot at when you're on the ground. Open areas also provide a lack of cover, which may not help out other heroes who lack the invulnerability that others have in their skill set. All in all, city's good. Big open desert spaces, probably very bad. Unless you've got like a camouflage ability, in which case this list is not for you. Moving on to something very ridiculous but also fairly accurate, and at 6, AK-47s. Or just guns in general. Okay, yes, this is a rather dark number, but you know it's true. While some heroes would be exempt from this harming them, like Superman for example, definitely could withstand a barrage of bullets, others who do not have that invulnerability would be majorly susceptible to gun wounds. We recently saw in Heroes in Crisis how devastating a mass shooting in the superhero world could be. It was a reminder that superheroes are not as invulnerable as we assume them to be, especially if their guard is down or they are hit multiple times. Riffing off of our last number in something equally as dark and kind of preposterous to think about in comics, in at number 5, gun laws. Now, a supervillain could use the lenient gun laws in the US to their advantage. Say that they wanted to gun down a hero and get away with it. Just lure them onto your own property and then fire away and then claim it was self-defense. I know, like I said, this is actually a very dark number because it happens in real life, but not with heroes, with regular people. Now, we won't be surprised to see something like that legally work out in favor of our hypothetical villain here, although that is kind of just strictly the US. That smug trick would not work in Canada, or a lot of other countries in the world. And at number 4, time management. Superheroes have lives too, you guys, and if there is one thing we've learned from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it's hard to strive for a life of normalcy when you've got to kick evil's butt. Often heroes are forced to choose between regular life stuff and saving lives, the latter being a quite demanding responsibility. I mean, Superman even quit once upon a time because of this, and I mean, he almost immediately returned to being a hero when he realized that Metropolis was kinda screwed without him, but still, if a villain really wanted to grind a hero down and had the patience to do so, they could learn about their hero's schedule, figure out their secret identity of course, and then plan a series of attacks at times that would be really inconvenient for their foe. Just hack their iCloud and take a look at their calendar. And then wait for their life to gradually fall apart and affect their superheroing. Wait till they're already vulnerable and then strike when they're most stressed, distracted, and foggy-minded. It's a little manipulative, sure, but I mean, as far as some villains are concerned, whatever gets the job done, right? Moving on to number 3, low confidence. Captain Britain, Gladiator, and Zatanna all share this weakness. Low confidence, especially in the superhero community, is one that can really punch you in the gut and lead to dire consequences. Generally, when this is a weakness of a superhero's, the more confidence they have, the better they are in combat. And then the opposite, the less confidence they have, the worse they are in combat. While some villains have taken advantage of this over the years, you would think that demoralizing and humiliating superheroes would be way more of a trend in the criminal community, since it's proven so effective on some other heroes. Just saying. I mean, I feel like that's a low though. Just go around on the superhero social media accounts and bully them online as some anonymous troll. Just make them feel terrible about themselves. And then they get out there and they're like, everyone hates me. And then they get beaten up by a villain. It's a hard life for a hero. You gotta have tough skin. Moving on to number 2, identity reveal. Now you'd think with the number of villains who have discovered superheroes' identities over the years, there would be a lot more whistleblowing in comics. Case in point, the Joker. When he knew Batman's true identity to be Bruce Wayne, he covered for the Caped Crusader and didn't tell anyone. Partially because, you know, he was obsessed with him and wanted to get him himself, but, you know, he's a fun individual. Quite literally. Now this is partially because the Joker is insane and utterly obsessed with Batman, therefore does not want anyone else to finish him off. But what excuses do other villains have? Revealing a superhero's identity or trying to rip off their masks in battle to expose them to the public would have a drastic effect on the character. It would ruin their private life, put them and all of their loved ones at risk constantly, and make it next to impossible to retain any sort of normalcy in their lives. A revealed identity though has helped some heroes rather than hindered them in the past. The likes of Ozymandias, for example, who used his fame to build an empire, or the Great Machine in Brian K. Vaughan's Ex Machina, who revealed his own identity to benefit his turn to politics. But generally we think it may hinder more than help in many cases, so it's surprising that more villains don't use it as a calming tactic to get what they want, although there are quite a few who have done that in the past. And last but not least, in at number 1, wardrobe malfunction. And no, we are not talking the likes of Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake, friends, and that is a bit of an aged reference, so if you know it just makes me feel old. When you think of death by cape, you often think of one of 2 famous instances. The first is Doctor Strange being strangled by his cloak in Marvel's Ultimatum. The second is Dollar Bill, one of the vigilantes on the Minutemen team in the 30s and 40s from Watchmen. The latter got his cape stuck in a revolving door, and a smart criminal used that opportunity to shoot him point blank. When you consider how effective using a hero's wardrobe against them could be, it's almost surprising that there aren't more villains trying to grab hold of heroes' capes to yank them close, strangle them, or put them in some sort of precarious position.
Let's start off gently at number 10, with Dr. Manhattan and Detachment. The Watchmen by Alan Moore, released in 1986 through 1987, is one of the defining graphic novels out there. A realistic story of pathos, loss, and despair. All of the superheroes are flawed, but Dr. Manhattan proves that a weakness can be a state of mind, and is perhaps only a weakness due to others' lack of ability to perceive it. After John Osterman is vaporized by an intrinsic field experiment, he reforms himself. However, in the process, he becomes something else entirely. A being of near godlike ability who exists outside of time. A state that gradually detaches him further and further from humanity as he slowly forgets forgets what it feels like to be a part of it. This detachment eventually leads to him not being able to be a superhero at all, due to a complete sense of apathy and inability to relate. Killing without feeling and unable to connect to anything, John eventually leaves the Earth behind to explore the universe's possibilities, but states he may return. So if your powers get to a point where you exist beyond morality, well, that's definitely a weakness for a superhero. But for a cosmic being, well, that depends entirely upon your philosophy. Something that is definitely a weakness in at number 9. We have heroin, used by Speedy, aka Roy Harper. Not all weaknesses are unrealistic or magical, and not all of them have to come from the outside or from villains. Heroes are just as human as everybody else, as proved in Green Lantern and Green Arrow number 5 when the Green Arrow learned that his ward/sidekick Speedy was on heroin. This team-up series was a 70s attempt to have superheroes tackle some hard-hitting real-world issues, some of which have aged better than others. One thing that stuck was Roy Harper's drug addiction, which was really introduced to prove a point to Green Arrow that not only poverty-stricken kids were drug addicts. So really it wasn't a decision that had to do with his character, but other writers took it and really used it to develop Roy. His struggles came to emphasize that being a sidekick came with its own pressures and pitfalls, and that not everyone could cope with the superhero lifestyle. Roy eventually recovered, but is still in danger of relapsing. His New 52 origin changed him to a recovering alcoholic, and his rebirth backstory is still developing. However, if used correctly, Roy can be an example of the real-life struggles some people have to go through every day. Which is not the case with our number 8. We have Superman and high sonar frequencies. Superman gets a bad rep as being overpowered and lacking in weaknesses, which makes his fights boring. But he actually has a fair few weaknesses, it's just writers rarely exploit them. Of course, Kryptonite is so well known, it has just become common parlance for any weakness. Another well-known one is red sun radiation, which basically weakens him down to a normal human level. But one not everyone thinks of is high frequencies, and it makes a lot of sense. Superman is Superman in many senses of the word. Keyword, senses. His are greatly enhanced, especially his hearing. He is able to pick up and distinguish individual heartbeats, so it shouldn't be surprising then that a high-pitched, well-directed noise blast pointed directly at him would prove crippling. Especially when you think about the fact that Jimmy Olsen's watch summons Superman by using a high-pitched frequency that blocks out all other noises briefly. This one is more of an extrapolation and less established firmly in lore, but really it sounds like a lot easier to build this kind of sonar machine than going on a quest for kryptonite, or trying to blot out the sun. But hey, you do you. Someone else who can't stand the noise is our number 7. Daredevil. Again, is this surprising? Well, it depends on the writer. Matt Murdock's second sight and how powerful it is really varies depending on who is writing him. Is he perfect and untouchable, or flawed and more human? Well, for one arc, the Daredevil's weakness was noise pollution, which for those not in the know is a harmful or annoying level of noise, such as from an airplane or industry. Now the thing with this one is that while the Daredevil has lived in a city pretty much his whole life, so the question is, does the noise pollution need to increase? Does it happen when he's in an unfamiliar area? How quickly can he adapt? Are his villains well enough aware of this to really use it against him? Based on how key hearing is to the Daredevil's ability to, well, see, this makes sense in theory, but in practice would need some pretty consistent rules to be an effective weakness. So I guess how rarely it is used or thought of could make it surprising. Up next at number 6, the Green Lantern's rings and the color yellow. So for a while, Green Lantern power rings were affected by the color yellow. This was for reasons that have changed over time. First, it was a design flaw, but it was later revealed to be because of an impurity within the central power battery. That was then said to be from the now Fear entity and not just insane Hal Jordan, Parallax. However, this latest update also allowed for the ring bearers to be able to overcome this weakness, rendering it inert. Because, well, most people thought it was silly, and it was. However, it did give us some hilarious panels, like Hal knocking himself out on a yellow billboard, or getting knocked out by a yellow lamp, or more recently in the extremely poorly executed All-Star Batman and Robin having to fight Batman in an entirely yellow painted room, facing a Batman who is also painted yellow, who is drinking lemonade. Ridiculous and hilarious. Something equally funny, at least with the covers they made for it, is our number 5, Aquaman and dehydration. Aquaman has it rough. People make fun of him all the time, be it for his silly costume and lame powers, which is odd when you think about it. Most of the Earth is his domain, and he has some pretty intense telepathic abilities and great combat skills. Maybe now that he's being played by Jason Momoa, people will stop making fun of him. I know I don't want to fight Jason Momoa, but I will fight Silver Age Aquaman, because in the late 50s, Aquaman had had to come into contact with water every hour or he would die. This was a retconned weakness because prior to that, Aquaman could exist indefinitely out of water, and he would be able to do so again in the following decades. But for one brief moment, if you could keep Aquaman in the desert long enough, you would be victorious. It's pretty inconvenient to have to ride around such a handicap, so I can see why this one didn't last. I mean, I guess he could have had a utility belt full of water bottles. Still, it is surprising that some small aspect of this didn't linger. However, who knows, maybe in the future some part of it will come back. It could work if the time frame is less restrictive. Moving on to number 4, Captain Marvel, now currently Shazam, and his weakness, saying his own name. Shazam has had a long, complicated legal history with comparisons to Superman and also who has the rights to the Captain Marvel name, a battle which he obviously lost. But his creator's inability to win a lawsuit isn't his only weakness. Young Billy Batson gained his powers from a wizard he met in the subway system so that he could fight humanity's 7 greatest enemies, which were ideas, not actual villains. Things like greed, sloth, and envy. He could access his powers by saying the word Shazam, also the name of the wizard who granted him said powers. Upon saying the magic word, the 10 to 12-year-old, it varied, would transform into the adult Captain Marvel, a superhero with super strength, flight, and a sense of moral duty. Whether or not he kept his childish mind has varied over time, but to turn back into Batson, he also had to yell Shazam. The only thing, the transformation involved him being hit by lightning. He has used this to his advantage by yelling Shazam and trying to get his opponents underneath the lightning. However, this also means that he can accidentally turn himself back into Billy Batson mid-fight, or other people can make that happen, as occurred in the memorable Justice League Unlimited episode, Clash, which was super awkward because no one knew that he was actually a child. Now there's another lawsuit waiting to happen, but Shazam would probably win that one. Still, having a magic word everyone knows is key to your transformation, probably not the best thing for a well-known superhero. Another superhero whose weakness is pretty well known is our number 3, the Martian Manhunter. The Martian Manhunter is terrifying. His array of powers are just astounding. He can shapeshift, phase, elongate. On top of all this, he's a powerful telepath. He can not only read minds, but also link non-telepaths up using his own telepathy. He can use mind control, astral projection, possession, so why would anyone ever dare go up against him? Well, thankfully, he does have some weaknesses. One key one, that being fire. This weakness has been part of his character for a long time, but it's really inconsistent how much it affects him and when. But currently the most accepted reasonings are that it is a crippling phobia developed after witnessing the death of his race. It was a fear placed there by the Guardians of the Universe in the Trial by Fire storyline, but since the New 52, it just seems to be PTSD. John Jones, the Martian Manhunter himself, feels it's a silly fear to have, and many readers seem to agree. But hey, PTSD is serious business, and your hero has to have a weakness, otherwise it's just not a fair fight. Being able to pick up your opponent's weakness at the gas station though, makes the fight seem a little bit more appealing, but it's still terrible odds. However, your odds get a lot better if you have the required materials to fight our number 2. The Green Lantern again, yes, but not Hal Jordan, this time we have to go back to the first purple cape wearing Green Lantern, Alan Scott. Back in the 1940s, when Scott found a green meteor that told him how to construct a ring from its metal, Scott decided to fight crime, first seeking out the criminals who had caused a railway bridge to collapse where he worked. It was here he discovered this magical cosmic ring's one weakness: wood. Ordinary wood. He learns this when he is bludgeoned with a club. His ring could also not affect wood, which in the 1940s would have been a pretty big hindrance. So remember, phenomenal cosmic power can be defeated by going to the hardware store and getting a 2x4. Look, it was the 40s, comics were being pushed out like crazy and the expectations were different. There wasn't always time or demand for some deep backstory as to why a weakness was what it was. Some heroes' first comics don't even have their origins in it. Still, in hindsight, this is pretty hilarious. Which brings us to number 1, Wonder Woman. Okay, before we get into it, this one takes some explaining and isn't in use anymore. However, it is very much of its time, and it honestly still gets a bit of a bad rap. In the 1940s, when Wonder Woman was created, her weakness was specifically having her hands bound together by a man. Wonder Woman comics are notorious for the amount of bondage in these comics, particularly on the covers. Princess Diana is tied up left, right, and center. There were many reasons for this. One was to not scare off young male readers by making her appear too dominant. Another was that the creator believed that bondage was a healthy part of normal human relationships. as for this weakness, it's actually not as sexist as people think. The reason it was male specific was the symbolism. Wonder Woman explains that for an Amazon to permit herself to be chained by a man, she becomes as weak as any other woman in a man-ruled world. If you think about it, it's actually an extremely convoluted attempt to express why a woman should be careful about giving up her agency. It's simplistic and not as nuanced as it could be, but it has more reasoning behind it than a lot of comic book decisions being made at that time, like say, wood. In fact, the creator, William Moulton Marston, created her because he felt there was a void in comics for female superheroes. He wanted to make young girls feel good about being female. His attempts at Wonder Woman's character were based on trying to boost female self-esteem based on the understanding of gender norms of this time. He stated, and I quote, "Not even girls want to be girls so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, and power. Not wanting to be girls, they don't want to be tender, submissive, peace-loving as good women are. Women's strong qualities have become despised because of their weakness. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all of the strength of Superman, plus all of the allure of good and beautiful woman." Yeah, in hindsight, it's pretty silly for one of the strongest beings to be held in place by normal rope. So yes, his execution definitely needed a little work, but it has some solid reasoning behind it for the time. Still, for many, especially out of context, this is one surprising weakness.